All right, you're live.
Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is Senate IT and Institutions, and we are resuming our work today to speak with Lisa Gobbin, consultant with the Joint Fiscal Office. And as everyone knows, our jurisdiction has been expanded to include IT. And we are getting as much information as quickly and as possible, coming up to speed on how the state handles IT in terms of procurement and evaluation and all of that good stuff. So if you're ready to, actually, we should introduce ourselves to you. I'm Wendy Harrison. Wyndham is my district, and I'm the chair of this committee.
Sam Douglas in Orleans County.
Joe Major, Withington.
Bank Senate District and the Vice Chair.
Well, we won't go there. So that's those are part words. And then Senator Ingalls from Essex, and he'll be in.
Okay, great. Well, since you've introduced yourself, I'm Lisa Gobbin for the record. I'm the contracted IT legislative consultant with JFO. My background since we first meeting, I was the IT director at the Department of Education at that time for 7 years. We did some pretty large, successful projects, IT projects back then. Our first data warehouse, which was a coordinated effort with school districts. And I also served on an advisory committee to the then CIO, Tom Murray. As being part of one of the larger IT departments in state government at that time. And then after 7 years with the state, I went out and worked for a private company for a line of business software company. But what that means is think permitting, licensing, grants, the common functions across state government. And I worked with other agencies across the country and also in Canada as well. Including the state of Colorado, state of Connecticut, state of Massachusetts, did a large project for the Federal Home Loan Banks. And my role with the company was to lead the projects, design the approach to the projects, really make sure that we had a proper understanding of how the enterprise in that state worked, meaning the projects were always multi-agency projects, so you need to know what the governance structure within the state government was in order to set it up appropriately. It also exposed me to different models of how central IT works across the states, which is finding very helpful now to draw upon. So I was there, and then I decided to leave and form my own company. To be honest, I really wanted to get more back into serving agencies versus software companies. It just felt more of a natural fit for me. And I did a large project for then it was the Agency of Education here, when they were implementing a central data collection system, so that the school districts could automate the upload process of submitting data of the core data collections and have a data storage system. So that's where my background is. I've started here. This is my 4th January, and I replaced someone, Dan Smith, who was in this role, the starting role here when this position was formed. So that's my background. Let me share my screen so I can talk through what I do.
And Senator Ingalls, I've introduced you when you were here. So.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. So for supporting oversight, I provide recommendations and advisory memos. So for example, if a budget comes out and there's an IT project to be funded and it's not a project that JFO is going to do a full review on, I might do a look at the project and come back with, raise any concerns or just give an overview and my general thoughts on the projects as presented by the state. There's also been instances like, and I'm bringing this up for a reason, the unemployment insurance, right? When I started, it was right at the very end of the pandemic. And there was a question on whether the legacy system, the old system currently in place at the Department of Labor, could be changed to distribute additional funds. And it was really looking at that the state had come back and said, no, we can't do that. And I really looked at that to say, is that a reasonable response? And I determined that it was, because the legacy system was just old, nobody knew the language, and it was just not something you'd want to get in and mess around with. So that's one area of support that I provide. Also, I do just the big reviews on projects, and that's based on how it's assigned by JFO, which is obviously based on how it comes to them from the requests coming from members and leadership on which projects they're interested in. I'm a part-time person, so I don't work full-time on this particular job. It's not funded in that way. So they're very specific on how I spend my time. And then, I'm sometimes just asked for targeted opinions, very brief, on something that's happening around IT, if I have an opinion around it. I've also, I have a body, the link on this particular slide, and I can make sure I send this to the committee assistant, is the location of the other memos that I've written on the past on different subjects. And other work as assigned by JFO, which could be most anything. So that's around the project reviews. I know Catherine spoke to you about this, and where she showed you the actual format that I used, which is kind of the matrix of the areas that I assess. And these are the areas that are listed on the slide. And so this ensures this, I'm sure she showed this
Yes.
to you, right? That always rings a bell for people. And that's where I provide an overview of all the analysis I've done targeted in specific areas. So that includes the project justification, which is really, why are we doing this project? Is it necessary? Is it beneficial? The clarity of purpose is the definition of success established for a project. Do they know what success looks like? Is it well defined? Organizational support, does the business fully support the project, which is key? Project leadership, does the project have strong and effective leadership? Project management, is the PM staff appropriate, and will they conform to existing state standards? The financial consideration, is the funding secure, sufficient for the anticipated life of the system? The tech approach, are proposed technical solutions achievable, realistic, and appropriate for this project? And then I add on the end the risk management piece. And usually these are areas when I'm reviewing a project that I'm looking at and I think we should keep an eye on. So one of the common areas that you'll see in probably most of the reports, if they're doing it, if they're replacing a project, is data migration, because it's very difficult. You have to do a lot of planning for it, because things like, you could have gender 1 and 2 in an old system, and then you have to, transform it to male and female and other appropriate responses to that. So it's not always straightforward to do the data migration, and a lot of times the old data violates the business rules in the new system, so it can be quite complicated. So that's an example of one of the common risk areas. Like if I don't see that fleshed out, I'll say while I'm looking at this annually, I'll pay close attention to how that particular area is going.
Okay.
So
Are you good with questions? As we
Yes.
go along?
yes,
So when you go and make one of these reviews, do you ask questions of the folks who are doing it, or and write your own report, or do they give you a report saying, oh, we think we're great in clarity of purpose?
no, I ask for artifacts and I have
Okay.
conversations. So I have a normal approach. So I ask for all the documents that have done to formulate the project as it stands. So for example, if they've issued an RFP, a request for proposal, that's when the state puts out their requirements, they post it for everybody to bid on. And I want all the background on where those requirements came from and what process they took, because that is really a key area on whether a project can be successful or not, whether they've done extensive requirements and they're clear on what the scope is. Because if you're not clear on something like that, then that's when later on you have to do change orders and you're not clear on your own requirements and the vendor's really in control after you sign a contract and they say, well, that wasn't in the scope. So that's an add-on. That's what they refer to as a change order, and it's all, they can add up.
So did you say you do it after the RFP?
Well, it depends on if the RFP's been done at this
Okay.
particular time. And that's a very important question.
Yeah.
Because, so typically the review is done once the RFP has been issued and they've done it, the CIO's independent review. The CIO's independent review is required by statute, and it's if a project is over $1 million, they're required, but there's an out unless the CIO says they waive it, but they're required to do an independent review. Now that's different from what I do. It goes into a lot more detail. They're doing, and it's the requirements are actually outlined in statute. Everything from the cost benefit analysis to they'll review the process, they'll review the selection process. They'll look at whether the solution that was selected is comparable to what's been implemented in other states, those types of things. So all of that is usually done up front, and then in order to do the review, I take all of that information as well as do some interviews. I have access to the Enterprise Project Management Office at ADS, their documents for the approach. And I review most of that stuff in order to come up with my own independent review. It's different from what the CIO's independent review is, in that we're taking, sometimes you find issues that were identified in the independent review that weren't outlined, or sometimes I identify different issues that weren't identified in the CIO's independent review by their vendor.
Okay, so just one more question on this.
No,
because
please.
I'm trying to understand why the state would intentionally not review it, and maybe there's other reviews until after the RFP. Why wouldn't you review it before the RFP? gets
Because
advertised?
the RFP phase is the culmination of the analysis that was done by the state. And then also the selection process. It changes the requirements, and you also want to see the contract as it's written, which is done after preferred implementation vendor is selected,
Okay.
because all of those can identify weaknesses can reveal weaknesses in a project. We'll talk about get into some of the other projects that I've reviewed, specifically the ERP, and you'll see some of the
Okay.
things that I've discovered
Okay.
just through this process and why it's done a certain way.
Okay.
And the reason why I'm, saying it's usually done, since one of the things Dan Smith mentioned when I joined was that he had been seeing projects that were brought for funding that weren't fully mature in terms of requirements, the way they had been done before. And by that, I mean, it was before ADS was formed, and this isn't, not, so for instance, for the unemployment insurance, they funded the project, but they asked that Dan said there isn't enough information. They were allocated in 2 different phases, and Dan Smith said, look, they didn't provide all the information, so let's put a caveat with the funding saying that when they have this information, they'll go to JITALK, and JITALK will determine whether they can release the funds or not. And so that was for phase 1 of the project, which was $3.5 million for the first part of the UI project. So this was a change from what he had seen, and he didn't feel he had all the information at the time the project was funded to say whether or not it should be a go or not. It was just not there. And now we're seeing this more of the norm. And so there's been more of a trend where there's been a need. Somebody asked me around, like when the ERP project was funded, we said, well, put in a caveat and say, well, look at what what you've come up with and when the independent review, and then we'll make a recommendation to JITALK. So that's been just more of a trend. So it's done a little bit differently than it had been in the past.
Okay.
So, yeah, I have a couple of questions. Well, maybe it's just just one, really. So the review that you do and the structure that you use, where does the structure come from for the review?
There's a document that was developed when the position was formed,
Okay,
and it was, what areas at that time, Dan Smith, does he think he needs to review that would capture the things that can go wrong with a project?
okay.
And that would provide an extensive review.
So that would have been developed by Dan Smith just for JFO,
Yeah,
whenever that was.
and it was all based on IT standards. For example, project management in here, is in there. And a lot of that, or all of these areas, you can go back to industry standards for, what's important around project leadership, what's important around organizational support. When I was in the private sector, one of the things my company had me do was develop really assessment of organizational readiness, because they had such a problem with moving into an organization when they weren't really clear on what they needed. And how can we do that in a delicate way and
Yeah.
just sort of add it to the project where we can say, we need to beef this up more. What do you mean by this before we enter into a contract with them? So,
Right.
so
I
this
can
is,
understand that would be
yeah.
challenging.
And these are common issues. It happens all the time.
Did you? Oh,
I just it's not a follow-up, but it sort of is. So when the position was created at JFO, structure of everything was different, but it's just you, just one person part-time.
Yeah,
And then an ADS has their own independent review.
That's right.
That's everyone that reviews it.
remember, I only do targeted reviews, just
Oh,
a
sure.
few projects. Yeah,
Yeah.
but yes,
But that's what's reviewed in the state. ADS does their review, you do a review if requested. And then maybe JITOC would look at.
yeah. And typically I do walk JITOC through
Yeah.
the reviews.
Great.
yes, Senator Engel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around about when this committee actually acts. So, and I'll at least say it this way, just DMV wants a new system. So they represent that they need a new need for the system. Does it go, who's it go to? Where's that go to first? Does it go to you folks first, or fiscal? Or is it come to us and we make that determination? Or how is this committee gonna be set up to so that those, because I haven't been on JITOC, I think you have, Madam Chair. So I know that JITOC was probably the entity or the group that saw all of this stuff, but just trying to get an idea in my head about when somebody wants something of significance, like a new system, when are we involved as a committee? Or do you know that, or?
Usually when the budget, it's either in the budget adjustment, whether they need additional funds for an existing system, or when they're requesting money to fund a system, and then it goes through, now it's House Energy and Digital Infrastructure. And I believe then it was sort of how it works between you all, it's a mystery to me. But that's how I typically have seen that.
And are we a oversight committee more than we are anything? We're not making decisions as far as what they absolutely possibly need, but we are an oversight to make sure that they are presenting a good enough case to where that's what they need. They need A, B, and C. Well, you know what? We can see that you need A and B, but we don't really think that you need C. So are we that?
We potentially could become that. I don't see that right now. I see us more like what JITOC does and what the House does,
Which is,
to approve the funding with awareness of the project and have the funding approval contingent on being confident that the project is designed.
or oversight.
Right.
We're oversight. Okay.
That's, I think that is what, I mean, we're new, so.
Right, no,
we
exactly.
can-
That's why
I mean, this is something.
that's
we
why
can talk about.
I don't know if Madam Chair, if it's to the point where we're gonna define the rules or the rules are defined for us. That's what I'm trying to get.
Yeah.
Are we setting this up? It's brand new. Are we setting it up, or it's been determined how it's set up? And we're following the rules that have already been determined.
It hasn't been determined.
Okay.
I mean, another example, last year, the administration requested money in support of the ERP system. It was for the business process reengineering. And in the end, between the House and the Senate, they decided, well, we're not going to provide those funds exactly, but we will change the language in the bill. So the money that's already been appropriated could be used for that purpose in addition. So, they found a way around it, but, so those are examples that I can give, but anything else, advice would need to come from JFO.
Sure, and I would like advice on where they think we could be more useful, most useful too.
Mhm.
And like thresholds of projects. I don't know if you do it by dollars or because there could be low dollar projects that are very influential
Well,
or impactful.
to be honest, everybody thinks IT is complicated, but I think your job is more complicated because you have to prioritize the requests of the administration against all the other requests that you have.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the hard part is.
Okay.
I can certainly advise you on whether systems, whether there's any reason or not, and answer your questions on what I see on systems. But you guys have the hard part, prioritizing all your decisions, so. Is there any other questions about this? Okay. So the projects that I'm monitoring are projects that were either put through, that they were put through an evaluation at one point. So at some point, there's an entry point into the system where JFO contacts me and say, look, we're going to evaluate this project. This is going to be one of your new projects. In the meantime, projects come and go. And these are the ones that I'm evaluating right now. And these are the ones that are also part of the report, which I just produced, which is, oops, I looked. I'm going to share again. Hold on. So this is the consolidated summary report. The link is on the agenda. This is an update that I produce every year at the beginning of each before January. That gives an update on what's happened to the projects that we've been monitoring. So to get you up to speed, I'll give you some background on these projects. The first one is the Integrated Eligibility and Enrollment Program. That's known as IE&E. And this project has a long history. I think I found documentation back to 2009 when it was first discussed. And then funding for 2012, which I believe it was around, I want to say around $9 million that was funded for this. And this is when they talk about the one-stop portal where citizens can go to a portal and fill out some information, and it tells them what type of programs they qualify for that are covered by the Agency of Human Services. That's what they're discussing for this. I believe there were a few times where they did a large bid process back around 2012. And then they didn't award the bid. This was around the time when there were issues with the healthcare exchange when that first came online. And so that caused everybody for big projects to say, well, we need to go and kind of step back because that had so many problems that they wanted to, before they jumped into another big project, they really wanted to assess things. So it went through a few different cycles. And I know it was when I came on, Dan gave me some history saying it was kind of reinvented back in 2017. But these projects that are done, receive the federal funding, they receive a lot of oversight from the feds. They have a few different agencies they have to go through for approval. And they're also required to fund an independent verification and validation vendor. This is a federal requirement. So this is another third-party vendor whose sole purpose is designed to look at the project on site, and they're employed by the Agency of Human Services. They ensure the work meets requirements, that they align to federal standards, and that it's been tested properly and confirmed before it's deployed. So the Fed, it's my understanding they have their own number of issues with projects that were federally funded that failed. So they developed this requirement for projects over a certain price, at least with human services. I think it's been great. I get a report, they do a monthly report that's provided to me every month along with all the project status reports. So every time when they want to do an RFP, they actually have to submit the RFP to a couple federal agencies, and they have their vendor look at it too, this vendor or the ID&D vendor. So it's quite complicated. It has a lot of oversight. This particular team came in after COVID and after the project was derailed because of the responses during COVID that the Agency of Human Services had to address. And so it did receive a new team, probably coincidentally, but since this team came on, they've really done a great job fleshing out the requirements in a way, in a level of detail that I hadn't seen before. And I think they're on a really, really good trajectory. And so that's very hopeful. Back in the original requirements for this project, the business case that was submitted was that this system is on, the current system's on Access, which is the old mainframe. And it's at the end of life. And this was back in 2012. So one of the concerns I had when I came on board was, where's all the concern about Access now? It seemed to have been lost. And I think it was really, in the end, I concluded they were the victim of the success of their own IT department. Their own IT department, they're like figured out a way to keep it going, and they just did it. And but I think that it became more of a risk because they lost sight of what a risk that did present business continuity. They were a victim of their own success with their IT group, right? And so the new project has requirements that when the system will be built, it'll update a new database, a modern database, but it also has to update Access at the same time because other programs use Access and they can't really sort it out, like what data is that different programs use come from IDME and what data comes from other areas. And they will have to do that. And those other programs will have to get off Access before they can eliminate it, but they're building it. So when that time comes, they can flip a switch and just be on the new system, but they are using a new database, which is key.
And it's cloud-based, right? Just a cloud-based.
The bid is out right now. We'll know what the solution is later, but
Yeah, I see.
the bid is.
It looks like bids are due January 28th.
That's right.
So that was yesterday.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah.
And then what's the timeline for the system to be operational?
Well, I think they're hoping in a few years.
Overall, incrementally.
Yeah. But they don't expect, because of the process between contracting and needing federal approval for everything and they have to go through an independent review, and JFO will do a review as well. So they expect that it won't be ready for JFO review until the fall.
Okay. So just one more question on this. I'm sure you're aware, like towns can piggyback on state contracts for certain state contracts. And I'm just wondering why the federal government wouldn't refer Vermont to other states that have done this and say, copy this. Or,
Well,
it seems like it'd be easier and quicker.
the IEM team did a lot of background work before they were planning to go out to bid, so they could get background on what other states were using for solutions, and actually talk to vendors to say, where are states kind of misstepping on this process? Because sometimes when you do requirements and they're overly prescriptive, they can get you into trouble because there might not be a system that does it that particular way. So they wanted to learn, how do the states meet the federal requirements and use a system that is used by other states, so it's a stronger, more mature solution and has a future. Because Vermont's been bid more than once about, developing a custom solution that only Vermont uses, and the vendor can't afford to support it and the state can't afford that system either. So I think they've done a good job of looking at what common solutions are out there that they can jump on. Now, it's not easy having designed enterprise solutions for states. Because it's not always easy to assume you can just jump on a system that the other state's running. It has to be configured because there are differences on how things are done. But I think they found that they've done the research that's appropriate in this particular situation to understand what's out there and make sure that they're not inadvertently creating something that requires a more custom solution. So I'm really happy about the trajectory of this. I wasn't always, and it's important to know that as throughout the course of this, they were always on their way to developing an RFP. They just stumbled a few times before they got there, and they're there now. So I fully expected to see a request within the budget. That work. Great. So the next one that has been monitored is the DMV project. This is a project that consisted of two phases: the vehicle services, which is title and registration, other customer facing services, and driver services, which is how we probably most know DMV, the licenses and other identification. So they started this project. It's been a few years now. They went live with the vehicle services November 2024. Yeah. And actually 23. And then 24, they were starting the driver services in 24, which they did. They started in June 2024. Their completion date is set for November. I made a note because in other presentations that I provided from data that started in phase one showed a completion date of July 2025, but it's November. When I talked to the new commissioner, he said no one could remember that it was ever anything but November 2025. So I think the information I had was just from preliminary before I had done the other review. But at any rate, this project they've met every deadline. You'll find the reviews out in the link in that first document. Okay. I will send it to the assistant. It was a great project then. It checked all the boxes. The vendor had completed DMV projects in 17 other states on time and on budget, which is unheard of.
Nice.
Commissioner Minoli was fabulous, doing such a huge change for a department and taking them so far ahead in terms of completely changing how they do business. And she really, she was a force in bringing employees along, which can be very difficult. So it was a great project when I first reviewed it. It still is. They were on track. They run into issues every now and then, like every project does, but they've successfully navigated them. The vendor here is FAST, and they are also the vendor that was selected for the unemployment insurance project that we're going to talk about. So that's sort of but if we go in order, did you have any questions about DMV? No. The judiciary system, I wanted in here just to close it down. They were awarded $4.6 million to complete, do a network, and create, rewire courthouses and create public Wi-Fi. If you remember, they had been in the news because they had problems with their network and it was interfering with their ability to use the case management system that they all use to manage cases. And they were delaying hearings because they couldn't access the system. And they started this system and completed it all within a year. Very successful, on time, on budget. And they've improved that they have public Wi-Fi now at the courthouses, which they never had before. And they have redundant network connections. So if one network goes down, they can seamlessly go over to a different network. Great project, good, really good outcome. And so this is just closing it down. They did a fabulous job. So this is a very difficult project. The unemployment insurance project, I know you are all familiar with that. It's a $30 million project in terms of the vendor, and has with the operating budget of 14 million over 5 years. It's had its own interesting life cycle, because when it was funded to do first the public portal, and that was a $3.5 million funding allocation, and then the back end part of it. So public facing versus everything under the hood, which was the 30 million part. As you can imagine, when you put out an RFP, it can get sliced differently, and you want to conform with how the vendor approaches it. The vendor selected was, again, FAST, who had a great record. They also, in addition to the successful DMP project, they were the vendor behind the tax department's software. So the state had a history of successful project with this vendor. They did on this particular project, and they have a product for unemployment insurance. So they opted to go with this vendor. I thought it was interesting, this project, because you could see how the requirements evolved over time from when they first issued the RFP to when the contract was issued, which is sort of perfect. Because you're learning things, you're working with the vendor, you're hearing from the vendor response, and you're moving all of what you've learned through that process into the contracting period. So the only thing that I noticed when I was reviewing this project was that they had the launch of the vendor slices this project into tax and benefits. So the system that deals with the employee taxes and collects the employer taxes and collects the information from the employers and the money from the employers, and then the assistance to the clients. So that's how this is set up, the tax module and the benefits module. The only issue I found when reviewing it is they had them be delivering the tax module first and then the vendor module the following year. And my comment was, I don't understand how you could do that with the legacy system that I had looked at, because how can you separate those two and still have it work? So in the end, in the first status report, they've collapsed those and combined those together. So now they have one deliverable at the end of the project, which I'm more comfortable with. It seems more realistic. So again, this was a positive project to review. It's going to be challenging. They've had a key department staff member leave. I spoke to Commissioner Harrington about this. They're managing the change as best they can. Those things happen, for all projects,
Yes.
So, the $30 million implementation cost, are we combining the total 5-year operation cost with it's about the same, but I mean, it's not, or was that at the beginning, it was going to cost 30 million and it ended up costing 45 million?
No, it's the technical implementation cost, the cost of the vendor for the software and to implement it.
Okay.
So, and that includes the data conversion pieces, moving all the legacy data over, all of that to implement the system. And the operational costs are the annual, I'm not sure, I can't recall if this member does subscriptions or licensing, but I think they're also hosting the solution. And so then you have the net total. Now, I have a note here that it doesn't include business costs related to staff augmentation. Now, I was just reading through my notes before this meeting, but labor had their operating budget increased by 3 million to deal with staff augmentation, and this didn't include that. We're trying to do a better job, and Senator Kitchell was instrumental in really saying, look, can you help us identify when all the business costs aren't included in the projects, because we think they should be. And so
that makes sense.
So yeah, and so we're really trying to do that, and it's not always easy, because it's usually not in the documentation that ADS provides, because they're focused on the technical portions of it, and yet it's a key a key piece. So we try and join them together in our reviews and our documents.
I'm just trying to understand. So you send out an RFP, you say, okay, this is how much we need. Your budget is $30 million.
What they do is the state looks at what other solutions cost in other states and
Okay.
makes the best guess and they ask.
All right.
So remember, they asked for 3.5 for the first part and 30 million for the second part. That was their best guess. They were pretty close and, you know, they still have a total cost of 45 million. So,
Right. So I guess, so you went over budget.
well,
Not you, but not you
Well,
personally.
you know, it's difficult for them to come up with a budget, especially right after COVID, people were charging a lot for everything. I mean, I went out, just asked some of my old colleagues, how much has your company gone up after COVID? And they were like 20%, 30%.
Wow.
So it's a timing too of when you're asking for the allocation and when it's coming through. I think they did a great job determining a budget for this. And this I'm not satisfied that this is all the costs. Again, you're doing the best you can at the time. You know, they were looking at doing a business process reengineering work at that agency. I'm not sure what that's coming, if they've made progress on that, and more will come. There's a document called the ABC form, and it's a budget form for each project. And they haven't, usually they don't update it until after they sign contracts. So the one I'm working with is their preliminary one. And then I do the best I can with that to try and update it in my reports based on what I do.
So you graded this strong.
Yes.
So so you're confident this is probably not gonna happen, but if there's another pandemic in a month, that this system will be able to accommodate where the other system was not.
We followed up on that during the RFP process and made sure we asked that question. Did you solve the problems that prevented the last one? Because we had made a commitment to the committee that oversees the labor. Yes, this project will do that. Again, and they still have to get through their implementation. This one could run into some more complications because they're really struggling with staffing at the Department of Labor. And it's not just a key staff member who left, it was happening before, but you know, when you look at this solution and you look at, they'll never, you know, this is as good as it's going to get. So they have to find a way through it. And it's a great vendor, you know, with a great record. They've been good for the state. So I'm comfortable. I'm not seeing anything of concern at this point. It's still really early since they started. They started the project in September of this past year. But I'm comfortable so far. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to say that, right? So,
It's
and
good to
then,
know. It really is.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's the bottom line. Was the problem solved? Was the problem solved? And that's the thing that I worry about, particularly if we're shelling out 45 plus million for an operation, and that particular system was highlighted as being woefully behind the times.
it was from the 80s, I believe, if not earlier. And
What are you saying? It was DOS?
it was before DOS.
Or DOS?
Well, it was a mainframe. It was like a,
Like COBOL or something. right?
yeah, it was like
Yeah.
S COBOL,
Yeah.
screen COBOL.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I had problems sleeping when I looked at the first system, that first time. So I'm optimistic about this project. It's not easy. They will run into issues, but I am optimistic.
Good.
So, which leads to the
Yeah.
ERP is, so the ERP project, and when I spoke to, House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Hetty, I don't think I did a good job explaining kind of how we got here on this project, on how I got where I am on this project. The state is happy with this project. It started, I believe, I'm not sure, have you seen the review that I did on this project?
some of us have.
You have, yeah,
But if you could discuss it, that would be really good.
Yeah.
We've heard a lot of, or I've heard a lot of, snippets of it.
Yeah.
And so this would be helpful.
it, the review, I had a problem. I didn't give it a very good review, to be honest with you. And I've been looking at this for a while, anticipating the review. Because it was a project where there wasn't a lot of information available at the start. And, information became available later, as we went. And some information was provided to me, some I found on my own, external to state sources. So, it was actually my first meeting, where I went and saw, ADS testify about needing money for, the financial module for an ERP system. They had received funding for a new HR system the year before. I think that was FY22. And it wasn't linked to an ERP system. They just said, we need to replace the HR system. This is how much it's going to cost, and it was funded. It wasn't reviewed by JFO. And so when I came on, this was just sort of like, hey, we're going to combine these two into an ERP system. And they listed this, for funding. They said, here are the states that are using the system that we're going to select, which is called Workday. And so immediately, I certainly made some assumptions about this project. One, the state has some rigorous controls over IT projects. They're encompassed in Bulletin 3.5, which is can be found on the site of the Agency of Administration. And what that does is it governs contracting, procurement, grants. So it tells you the process you need to go through too. And those involved RFPs, and there were always stringent controls for reviewing RFPs within the state. And they involve, stringent review for contract management, et cetera. So it wasn't so, and so they listed the states that were using the ERP project, the Workday ERP. One of the first things I discovered was that the states that were listed were using Workday ERP, but at that time, no state was using the ERP financial module. Workday is a solution that's used extensively in the private sector and also extensively in higher ed. I just want to be clear from the start, none of what I found has anything to do with assessing the quality of the vendor, the implementation vendor Workday. It's not this, it's about the state's preparedness for the project. And so when presented with this, House Energy and Technology, they said, well, look, there's other states using this, we can support this, but we put a caveat for funding in there that JITOC would review before the money was released. And that would be after they had issued an RFP for an implementation vendor. So they had chosen Workday as the software solution. So once they knew they had the conditional approval for the money for the system, the state entered into a contract with Workday. And after this occurred, I started doing some research in prep because I knew I'd be reviewing the project. They said the RFP was done by the National Association of State Procurement Officers. That's the organization that state government does use. And if this organization didn't exist, you'd wonder why, because it's a group of states came together and said, hey, we're small states, let's coordinate and we can get better pricing if we'll sign a contract that all of us can use, for cones and things like that. So that's where this organization came from. So they said that this organization did the RFP where Workday was selected. Okay. So when I started to look into it, I actually eventually over time was able to find the actual RFP, and it wasn't for an ERP system. It was for cloud services system. And the requirements for it was you must, in order to be on this contract, you must meet the NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a federal agency that does standards. You must meet the NIST standards for cloud services. And the organizations that were awarded contracts were everything from cloud services storage providers to network providers to Workday, which, was the only ERP included that received this. So through this, there was a mechanism for Vermont to purchase Workday, which I have nothing against Workday. The issue is part of the benefits of actually doing an an RFP, request for bid proposal, is that you're going through and understanding your organization's own requirements for this project that you're about to do. And this project isn't just implementing an ERP system. What you're doing is you're replacing 5 systems. You're replacing the HR system. You're replacing the state budget system, Vision, which is the state finance system and payroll, right? And then there were these 2 systems that are legacy system, STARS and FARS. STARS is a legacy finance system for the Agency of Transportation. I believe it's on a mainframe. And FARS, which is a legacy system for the Department of Labor, also no mainframe system. Now, these 2 systems weren't included when Vision was developed in the late 90s, early 2000s, because PeopleSoft couldn't meet the requirements of these systems. Labor requires actually tracking things down to a project level. And so when people do their timesheets, they actually have to go down to a federal project level. These are federal requirements for federal funds. Just like the Agency of Transportation is required to track projects down to the town boundary level, which is why they could never be part of Vision. So they have very unique requirements. And so by not doing a needs assessment and going through an RFP process, you haven't really done an alignment or a gap analysis between what you're replacing. And some of those things that you're replacing, maybe you don't need all the functions, but a lot of them you do. But you need to identifying your requirements and compare them to the solution that you're selecting. So at least you understand where there are gaps, you understand where those gaps are, and you can come up with a plan for filling those gaps. So by not doing your own RFP process to find your ERP vendor, you haven't documented all your own requirements and what needs to be done. So really you're saying, well, I'm just going to use this system and I will find out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
So it puts you at risk. Now, in the independent review, the CIO's independent review for this project, as part of what they saw as a positive business case, they said, hey, by replacing STARS and FARS, you can save, these systems have cost other states who have implemented new versions separately, $25 to $30 million. Like, well, I read it like, okay, so we haven't done the work to say that they can be replaced by Workday. We haven't gone through this exercise, so it could be another 25 or 30 million for each of these too. And I know I attended a demo that Workday had provided, and they mentioned that the Iowa Department of Transportation implemented the financial module for Workday. So I knew that was underway, and they finally went live. The rest of the state decided not to implement the finance module for Workday. And I have never independently found a reason why they didn't, but they didn't. But it's also was important that Workday said when they did this implementation for the Iowa Department of Transportation, they didn't include STARS because this is a federal requirement. So why wouldn't they if they could? So that was a concern to me. Yes.
I don't know why. And I know what they're gonna say, but I don't know why we just don't have one system that's plug and play. You can do with what you want. And then people are gonna say, well, you can't do that. It's gonna get hacked. It's gonna do this. It's gonna do that. Well, you've got Apple, who's got a vast system. You've got Google. You've got all of them. And I can't help but to believe that at the end of the day, it'd be cheaper to have just one system. Everybody learns it. I mean, you can't get into there because you're not allowed access into there. But if you're into there and you were to transfer over to this department, there's no more training. There's no more anything. You just have to understand what you're looking at and how to navigate it. It's a navigation issue more than it is a training issue.
It takes time to get to where you want to be.
Right.
Now Workday is one of those systems, but for ERP systems, remember, they're by being a cloud system, they don't vary. They all, when you implement Workday, it's one solution and all customers share the same solution. So they're trying to get away from the issues that they've encountered with Vision, where every, 5 years or so, they need to sink a certain number of, millions of dollars in to do an upgrade. So that's
That case exactly. It's because when you do that and you're already in there, upgrade other stuff in there as well. And then because you can do that. I mean, but maybe I'm just being too slow.
No,
Listening.
I know if Secretary Riley Hughes was here, she'd be like, that's what we're doing with Workday for ERPs. It's one solution, and it's none of this is about Workday or the solution that they pick. It's whether or not the state is prepared to successfully implement it. For example, I don't know if anybody here an accountant? No. For accounting system, they have the chart accounts, which are really the key codes that they use to categorize all expenditures and revenues, all money within the system. So they can identify it. And there's usually 5 different fields for it. When the state implemented Vision, they had a goal to have one chart of accounts for all agencies. And they deviated from that. So they're used separately in different agencies. Because STARS and FARS couldn't integrate with Vision, you would assume that maybe the natural way to find a solution would be within those chart of accounts. Is there a way to capture town boundaries and that the other minutia, the grain level size that is needed for that labor by using those codes? But that part, I'm not seeing where that part of the project is being done before the system started. So you're also kind of increasing the risk that those won't be included in that. And I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to kind of give you sort of that overview of some of the things that I found in that system and where we landed. I'm sure you know, JITOC approved the release of the funds so the state could get started on that project. Included in the report were recommendations for specific oversight based on the findings that I had. So at the stage when the state says they will have all this information, they're just paying the vendor to come up with it, to determine it. I would have,
Oversee itself?
I would prefer to know what the requirements were before I signed a contract. Because the contract that was developed is highly boxed. By that, I mean, they say you get this many chances at doing data conversion. And if you go over that, we're going to charge you. So you can see, I mean, because the vendor did the best they could. I like this vendor. I think they're really sharp. They did the best they could without extensive requirements. So they had to protect their own, interests by saying, we can agree to whatever you say you need. As we go through the project, we're going to have to box it. And that's exactly what they did. There will be a time, this is the money that's been allocated for this project is not enough for this project. There will be a time, like when I believe Denise, Secretary Hughes, Riley Hughes announced that it was March, they would have the requirements done with this project. I believe that's what they told JITOC. So they would know where the gaps were. I'll be looking at that, and the recommendations for oversight that are included in my review, those discuss bringing in business people with it, like the program leader for STARS and FARS, and say, do you know exactly what's covered by FARS and Workday that it can be met? Because the business people should know at that time what can be covered and what can't. And if they don't, that's a red flag. So the whole point of the questions and recommendations I made for oversight were based on the fact that, it's possible that this project is going to move forward and they will need more money. And how do you make that decision on whether to move forward or not? So there are many reasons why an IT project gets funded or doesn't get funded. And I would say a lot of it doesn't deal with technology per se. So I'm doing my best to identify where I see issues. I hope the state finds a way around it and can make this project successful, and I will be using some really great font for that. My next report.
It's fine.
I'm really pulling for them because they have a lot on their plate and everybody's doing their best. But I did have concerns with this project.
So is that this March that will be made or next
in-
March?
No, they had in the last Jai Talk meeting when it was, they were questioning on when they would know this. I believe they said March.
Okay,
Um,
so then we'll be here.
I had heard it would
Part
be
of
a
that.
few months, so I will
Okay.
keep you posted
Yes, please.
on what the timeline is. And if that changes, I expect we'll see some slippage in these particular areas, and I think it's important to keep an eye on those.
Right. Okay.
Well-
Well, thank you very much.
Well, this was a crash course. I hope I didn't. talk too
No, it's
quickly.
good. That was
I
good.
apologize.
So-
It was gonna be fun.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
very nice to meet you.
And very nice to meet you as well.
Yeah. Any final questions or anything?
Now.
Okay, and now we just have to process ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again, and I also wish them luck. And more than luck,